I feel like in analytics, we don't have that. In analytics, we're not opinionated enough. And so what ends up happening is you get all sorts of different projects, different ways of doing things. Now, DBT is sort of helping us get there, but there's still more to go. And so when you're deciding, should I do dimensional modeling or not, people don't even know which way to go. Right? And so when we're talking about tooling, what we're saying is we're going to tell you, use these tools. This will help you get from A to Z. Do it this way because this is a scalable way that'll be more resilient to change in the long term.
Greetings, everyone through here. Welcome to the Demo Hub. Welcome to another exciting episode. Today, we're going to talk about Datacoves. Datacoves is a turnkey analytics workbench that helps companies implement components of the modern data stack. Our guest today is Noel Gomez. Noel, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Really glad to have you. I'm a big fan. Really excited to hear more about Datacoves. But before we jump in, unpack that, can you talk about where you're calling from?
I'm in California, in Thousand Oaks, Southern California.
Nice. Always good to hear where folks are calling from. For the audience that haven't heard about Datacoves before, can you give an orientation? What is it? What are you building? And where does it fall within the modern data space?
Yeah, so Datacoves was our answer to the fragmentation that exists within the modern data stack. What we saw as we were helping other companies, we were doing some consulting and helping companies stand up the modern data stack, stand up their best practices and all of that kind of stuff. And we felt this is very complicated. I had been through this in the past. I used to work at a large enterprise and we went through a transformation process, and it was hard to do all of that kind of stuff. And it is still hard. And this is, I'm going back to 2017 timeframe. And I felt, there's a lot of great tools, but people need some guidance in how to go from zero to getting, a good scalable enterprise class stack. And in addition to that is the processes that go with that, because having tools alone isn't going to transform how people work with data.
Fascinating. Companies are always faced with that challenge of going from raw data to insights. So you're bringing a prepackaged solution to help with that. Is that a good summary of it?
That's exactly. It's an accelerator, right? You understand that you want to improve how you work with data. You are faced with having to learn a lot of different things. You may be learning about DBT or Airflow or Fivetran. There's many different things, and we're coming in with an opinionated, like, here's a starting. Here's how you should compare Snowflake versus Databricks. Here is how you do security as code. So they may not be used to those kinds of concepts. How to apply software development best practices into analytics is not something that many people are used to. So it's how do you quickly ramp up, not only from the infrastructure side, but also from the process side.
No, you do have a presentation that really touches on a couple of these key concepts, but is the focus bringing together this open source tools, full-blown solution, or are you leaning in on proprietary tools? Just touch a little bit on what tools make it into that space.
Yeah. So we're kind of mixing those two because we don't want to be completely saying you must only use open source. So for example, if you think about the ELT orchestration and visualization, the visualization space, there's many tools. A lot of organizations already have tools, say Tableau, Power BI, Looker. And we're not necessarily saying get rid of that because, you don't necessarily need to change that to change your ELT process. We work, or we have as part of our solution, Airbyte, but it doesn't mean that if you prefer to use Fivetran, it's okay. We'll work with both, and I'll show a little bit of that in my demo. The key idea here is how you use these tools together. So you may not understand how are you going to orchestrate Fivetran along with DBT, right? That understanding that if you go at this incrementally, you're going to have to figure out each step one thing at a time. That being said, everything that we do, we do believe in open source. We have open source libraries and projects that we support. So we don't necessarily lock you in. You could start with Datacoves and you decide you don't like it. There's nothing holding you specifically to what we have because you could do it all on your own. What I have seen is that people underestimate the work that it takes to get something like this up and running. So they may say, oh, I just need DBT core and I just need VSCode. Okay, you could start that way, but at scale, that's very hard to scale across multiple developers, handling things like version upgrades, installation. There's many things to consider that people don't necessarily think about when they're starting out. And so just using open source is not as simple. There's more work to be done.
A friend of mine once described it as almost getting a free puppy. It could be free, but there is some work that goes with that. So I do understand you have a presentation. Do we want to bring that up on the screen and go through that for the audience, touch on some of the details around this?
Sure. So the problem we saw at a high level is there's a lot of tools. If you are just starting out, which data warehouse do you use? Which extract and load tool do you use, et cetera? There's many decisions, observability, data catalogs, you name it, a lot of different things. And you could spend your entire project just researching and POCing all these different options because there's so much to be done. And then if you look at this, because it is so fragmented, the problem space becomes, like each tool independently, but it's left up to you to figure out how it's all going to work harmoniously. Because in the end, you need a process. You don't need just an EL tool, just an orchestration tool, just a transformation tool. You need it all to work together. So you got to figure out how that's all going to integrate. Then you got to figure out how you're going to secure it, right? You got to make sure like, how do you handle authentication, authorization? If you have PHI data and all this kind of stuff, how does it work? How do you make sure that it's reproducible and auditable and all that kind of stuff? And along with all of this, we talk about the fact that you need some best practices. You may be starting out and you're hearing about different modeling techniques. Do you do Kimball? Do you do Inman? Do you do Data Vault? Have one big table? And these are, again, more and more concepts that people need to understand when they're starting out this journey. And so we think there's a lot to be figured out. And what we've seen is that when technologists, people who are, platform architects type of people or very IT focused, they tend to focus on this innermost circle here where they go and evaluate the performance of Redshift versus Snowflake versus Databricks versus BigQuery, like something that's very quantifiable. And so they go, well, our old platform was X and this is Y and it's a lot better. We should do that. And they tend to pick all the different tooling that way. But if you think about why they needed to do that, it ends up being there were bigger organizational problems that necessitated that initial search, right? I can't get reports out fast enough. There's a lack of agility, there's data quality issues, et cetera. So what we talk to people about is unless your new technology is changing how you do this middle layer, these people aren't necessarily getting a better result, right? So we want to change how people work with data. So we want to be thinking about things that you could do now, maybe you weren't able to do in your old platform. So things like DataOps, things like managing everything as code, applying software development best practices. How are people going to collaborate? So in the past, you may have had tools that were specific to IT and tools that were specific to business users. But now we have tools like DBT that say, well, if you know SQL, we can make that the common language, the common vocabulary across these different teams. So that's something else that we can think about. And we start with these really high level guiding principles. So when we look at these projects, we want people to think about how is this new platform going to improve trustworthiness? How is it going to improve usability? How is it going to improve collaboration, et cetera, right? So we talk at a very high level about how technology and process changes come together to really change and transform how people work with data. And so Datacoves starts out with, an end-to-end turnkey stack. So you don't have to worry about how do I get SQL Fluff working with VSCode? How do I get, previews of my data? And we'll show this in the demo as I'm developing. How can I preview this stuff? What extension should I be using when I'm working with Snowflake? There's many, many things to be figured out. well, we figured that all out for you. And you don't necessarily need to implement everything right away, but when you're ready, it's there for you. We want to make sure that the infrastructure is scalable, because if you think about where you are today, you're not necessarily thinking about the future. And so maybe you're a team of that is 3 people or something, but you got to think about like, what am I going to set up today so that when I have 20 analysts or 20 people working this stuff, it's going to work. When I have many jobs, orchestration gets more complicated. How do I handle all of that? So we give you pre-configured VSCode and DBT, because we feel that VSCode is the best editor out there. So why not give you that? And then we're giving you these accelerators that have, kind of guidance on best practices.
That is awesome. You touch on all the spectrum, not just focusing on the technologies and how fast queries are running, but delivering actual business values to the end users that drive business outcomes. Now, who would you say is the audience for Datacoves? Are you talking more to the data engineers then, or is it more on the executives?
So it's typically the people standing up these platforms. So in a large organization, I've worked with very large enterprises and also smaller companies. So in a large enterprise, I may be talking to the heads of data, or the people who want to empower their teams, who want to transform because they're having some pain points. But when it comes to the actual technology, it's working with their architects or their platform engineers or people like that, because they need to bring in, a lot of this is new to the organization. So it's a lot of this, kind of deeper discussions. In a small organization, it may be one and the same. So you may have like the first hire who is tasked with standing up the modern data stack, and they may feel overwhelmed. We actually have someone like this as one of our customers who we interviewed recently. And he said he used to work in a larger organization and they did everything themselves. So like essentially they build like their own Datacoves, and it took them over 9 months. And he said, essentially, I did the same thing in a week because you did it all for me, essentially. And one thing that I didn't touch on is that we have a SaaS version, and we can also deploy within the organization private cloud. So within their Azure or AWS account. So that's also something that's important when we're dealing with life sciences companies that have patient data and they have more heavier security requirements, let's say, and also getting approval from their compliance and data privacy departments is difficult. We can just put it in there, comply with all of their standards, their authentication, authorization, etc.
Okay, really good. Do you see particular industries receptive to this, or is it across the board? The reason for asking is, with the accelerators you have, is there a certain slant to, say, your life sciences or fintech, manufacturing, CPG, or is it just data is data and everybody has a data problem?
That's right. Yeah. What we try to do is pretty generic. So it's, here's a way to do security in Snowflake as code, not specifically to life sciences, but if you have sensitive data, here's the piece, thinking about things like role level security or dynamic data masking. It's kind of baked in following this guidance that we provide, but it doesn't really matter. We're just kind of telling you like your data lifecycle is from raw to staging to core models and marts and stuff. So it's that kind of stuff. So when a user comes into Datacoves, we started this launchpad. Now here you'll see many of these environments, but typically they wouldn't see all of this. We start with the concept of a project. So a project is a link to a Git repository. This happens to be on GitHub, but we support any kind of provider. And by the way, if we're deployed within the organization's network, then we can connect to their Bitbucket or GitLab or whatever is hosted within their organization.
This is the SaaS version of Datacoves.
This is the SaaS version of Datacoves.
Okay.
Exactly. Yes, correct. But it's exactly the same, whether it's SaaS or not SaaS.
Okay.
And so then within a project, you have multiple environments. So that's what we're seeing here. And what we're seeing is that in this environment, we have different stacks. So here we see that we only have essentially VSCode and the local DBT documentation, and we would have like different DBT adapters. So here you have one that's Redshift or Databricks or DuckDB, and I'll get into this Snowflake one, but then you can see that what we have is then we can turn on and off these different services. So Airbyte, Airflow, even Supersets, what we have by default for visualization. So you take it or leave it with this stuff, essentially. don't have to use everything, but if you need it, it's there. One last thing here is that we don't have to use Datacoves for DBT. So here's an example of using Datacoves for Jupyter development, or we have a customer that felt like, oh, this is VS Code. Can I just do Python development? Had nothing to do with data transformation itself. So we can do that as well.
Just to get the vocabulary right, I think you call this projects, but is this considered a stack? If we take a look at like the dev Snowflake, within that you had DBT, Airflow, would that then be what you consider a ready-made stack to run your Snowflake solution?
Right. So the project is the top level. And then within the project, you have environment. So think about in the real world, not in this demo environment, I would have a development and a production version of this, for example. So like I would have dev Snowflake and prod Snowflake, and then I would have multiple airflows as an example. So I may have the airflow where I'm testing things out, and then my jobs run in the production airflow. Same thing with DBT docs. I may have the production DBT docs in this other environment. And then I can control, we have role-based access control. So we can say only developers get access to this development environment, and, users that want to just look at DBT docs can see it over there. And, so we can have all of that kind of flexibility.
In the real world too, you would have a super admin that configure this, and then the everyday users are essentially just using the stack then.
Right. So here you can see the menu for administrators. We're in the process of changing this a little bit, but here's where you would create more environments. If I want to create a new test environment that has a test airflow, you would do it there. Here's where I can configure my different projects. So multiple Git repos. And then we have this concept of connection templates. So think about whenever I'm connecting to a database, I need things like the host, the default role and things like that. Well, instead of having the users having to put that every time, we just have a template, and then the users just have to change their username and password, for example. Same thing for service accounts. So you need service accounts when your automated Airflow jobs run. So we have that there. Integrations with other things like Microsoft Teams is something that we support, or sending emails when jobs fail. So that's where you would configure it here. So this is something that the administrators would do. Also invitations. So in the SaaS version, I want to invite you to this project. I would do it here, managing what groups users have. So yes, not everybody has access to this, only the administrators do. So let's go into this environment. So as you can see here, we're along the top, you see all the different services. So we have the load, the transform, observe, orchestrate, and analyze.
Essentially, you have an extended version of the ELT. You're loading data, you do some transformation on top, you put in some observability, orchestrating, and then analyzing that, which I'm guessing is probably the reporting side.
Superset. That's
Superset.
right.
Got it.
Yep. So all of these are the different tools, which traditionally would be separate places, right? Essentially, we've managed all the orchestration, we've managed all the security and all that kind of stuff for you. So this is essentially just Airbyte. So in Airbyte, it works similarly to Fivetran, where the user comes in, they select the source, they have these pre-configured connectors, they provide some information, and they can authenticate and then connect this source to some destination, which is what we'll see here. So here I have some file sources that end up in my Snowflake. Now, what's interesting about this is not just that you can do this. Obviously, you could go do this with Airbyte at any time. But what I do, or what we have as part of those recommendations, is how to do this. So for example, we say, do not do transformation. Load your data as raw JSON. Okay, because that is more resilient to changes in the schema. New columns come in, columns leave, etc. And then we have accelerators to flatten that for you. So I'll show that later.
This is really exciting to double click on this for folks that are familiar with Airbyte. Airbyte does have a UI. You can access that from a different URL, but you've embedded that into the Datacoves, so you have one experience and you're not having to bounce around potential different URLs and different logins, and you're just coming into one experience.
Yeah. And that's really important, because we'll see when we get to VSCode, it's the same thing. With you think about when you're using VSCode and you want to look at something in Snowflake, that's a different URL. I have to go to some other tab, and we're trying to make it all like cohesive, keep people in the flow, they'll talk about that kind of stuff. If you're doing something, you don't want to keep jumping around, figuring out, where do I go? So we'll show that there, but that's exactly right. We want to make sure that you could easily switch between these different experiences without really leaving, completely leaving something. But this is exactly the same Airbyte UI that you would have if you install this yourself open source.
Okay.
With the difference, one thing that I will say is that, this is all running in Kubernetes. So whenever these jobs run, they can scale. They'll start up different pods, different services, containers, so that you can have many of these things running and it'll scale well. Whereas if you did it yourself, you got to worry about, okay, do I run this on a EC2 or some other VM? And again, there's a lot more complexity than just install open source.
Exactly. And just one question here before we jump off. How do you then manage the versions as Airbyte comes up with new versions across maybe the SaaS application versus folks that are installing it, the on-prem version? Just maybe touch a little bit on that.
Yeah. So that's a really good question, because we don't keep this at the leading edge. If you actually look at the releases from the Airbyte team, it's very frequent.
Mm-hmm.
What we try to do is at least quarterly get this up to date, and it's more based on demand. Like, so if we're not running into a problem, then there's no rush to upgrade this.
Mm-hmm.
But if one of our clients has a problem and say like, oh, this connector isn't working, or we need this new feature that's only available, then we'll speed that up. So we can do it. Everything is running in Kubernetes land. This is called Helm charts. So it's like these recipes that will install this stuff. But for us, it's not very hard to do, but we want to make sure that when we put this stuff, that it's tested, that it works well, that that things don't change. So I'll give you a very good example. There's a difference between the current version of Airbyte and this one that we're looking at, in that up to, I don't remember when it was released, maybe within the last month or two, they added authentication in the open source. And so we need to now account for that when we're doing that within Datacoves. And so all the other tools, so when we get to Airflow and Superset, they already had an authentication mechanism. So we just integrated with that. But it's new in Airbyte, so we have to figure out how are we going to integrate that so it's a seamless experience for the user.
Excellent.
Yeah. And then one last thing I wanted to show here is, back to the recommendations, we say, run this manually. Do not schedule this here, because we're going to use Airflow to do the actual orchestration. So again, it's that mix of the technology and then how to use the technology, how to run it. Okay. So now if we go here, this is now the VSCode environment, hosted VSCode, and you can see that we have pre-configured certain extensions. So this is Datacoves Power User, which is a fork of DBT Power User with some additional things we've added. We have the Snowflake extension, their official extension. Here I have a ChatGPT extension. We'll show all of these kinds of things. But one thing that we can do in Datacoves is we can actually install, pre-configure any VS Code extension. It's a huge marketplace with a lot of great things out there. We can also have Python libraries. So, for example, you may want to use Snowpark. Why not? So we have that power. We have a full terminal here. And actually, you can see the last time I was running this, here I was running Snowpark, and I'll just skip ahead and just open the Snowpark demo. So here, one thing that we simplify is how do you connect? How do you authenticate with Snowpark? Think about that. Mm-hmm. Users may, I'll put my username and password in here, then they'll check it into Git or something. Like, no, don't do that, right? So, I'm going to give you this method. And what this is doing behind the scenes is using the same authentication method that DBT itself uses, so that then this script will authenticate the same way, essentially. And then I can just run normal data frame, Snowpark operations here, which is what we're seeing as an output down here. I mean, I'll run it again, but again, that's the whole idea here, is simplifying this, giving you that accelerator to get this stuff done without you having to figure every piece out. Okay.
Quick question on this. Guessing you support both DBT Core as well as DBT Cloud, or is it mainly?
It is only DBT Core. So we're managed DBT Core provider.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. And so because we're doing more than DBT. So for example, you can see this directory structure is more than DBT. DBT is just this one folder, right? So here's the DBT project that you would normally see, but we have other pieces here. So here's the CI/CD scripts that we have for GitHub. And we have done this with GitLab. We've done this with Jenkins. So again, you don't have to figure this stuff out. We'll just tell you, here's automation scripts that we may have, like here's a blue-green deployment in Snowflake. So again, this is not a trivial thing to be figured out. We're going to give you this accelerator, like here's how you do it. Here's some other scripts to get artifacts. So if you want to use the deferral and Slim CI stuff, you got to figure that out. So again, we give you all of that. If we look further down here, we saw that in Airbyte, we were configuring things through a UI, and you would do the same thing in Fivetran. But I think bigger picture, I think that, what happens when somebody goes to that UI, changes something, and something breaks? You don't have a way to recover because you're just configuring something in a UI. Well, what we've done here is extracted that so that you have that configuration saved as a JSON file, and then you could replay it back into, in this case, Fivetran. So configure it there, save it in your repo, and then play it back. Yeah. So it's thinking about those kinds of things more for high availability, disaster recovery, all of those kinds of concepts. Here we have some stuff for observability. So if you wanted to have a Streamlit app, now this isn't released yet, but my assumption is that Snowflake is going to have a way for people to host Streamlit apps within Snowflake. Well, what do you do when you're developing, right? You want to develop something. Well, we handle that here where you can develop within Datacoves, test out your application, then eventually deploy it over there. Here's the stuff that has to do with Airflow. So your Airflow DAGs, we also give you, the reason there's an images folder is we're going to give you a default image, but you may have additional dependencies. So we have some people that need additional Python libraries. And so, well, you would start with a Docker file and add additional requirements. And then you build this image and then you can use it in your Airflow. One other interesting thing that we did here is we use this thing called DAG Factory so that users can build DAGs with YAML. Felt this is more consistent with like the DBT way of doing things, right? Yeah, YAML and SQL. And so what we say here is like, okay, well, you just kind of copy this stuff. And so it's simpler than learning Python. Now, what you can see here, though, is if we look at these.
And so this is building the Airflow DAGs directly.
This compiles into an Airflow DAG. Exactly. Okay. So you could do it either way. So you could write a Python file or you could use a YAML DAG. So here's like a simple YAML DAG, so you could just run any, here's a custom image and do whatever bash command you want to do. But in a normal job, you would have some sort of loading. So here I'm loading some stuff in Airbyte, loading some things from Fivetran, and then I run my actual DBT transformation. But one thing that we did that was a little different is that I said, typically you would have to figure out what dependencies I have between my EL and my T. So if I don't want to run the entire DBT project, let's say I have two sources and then I want to run part of my DBT project. Well, the way that you would typically do that is you put some tags on the DBT side that says, I only want to run these 5 models. But on the load side, you still have to figure out what are the dependencies of those 2 tables that I need to load before I run that subtag. I said, but DBT already knows that, right? DBT already knows what my sources are. So why don't we work backwards? So what we do here is we say, use the DBT selection syntax, select a tag, and then use the tag to trigger whatever I need in the load step. So we use the DBT information to figure out what to trigger in Fivetran or Airbyte. It's dynamic.
Okay.
All right. And then we just run DBT with the same DAG selection. But, it's these kinds of things that, again, I'm trying to simplify how people do this stuff. Here we have the security. So how do you do your Snowflake roles and all that kind of stuff? It's all code. It's all here. And then here we actually get into the actual DBT. You can see here we have SQL Fluff. So maybe you're not ready for SQL Fluff, but once you figure out that you want to do linting, eat SQL Fluff, it's there. You can see down here, we also have pre-commit. So we're using DBT Checkpoint, which is another project that we sponsor. And this is essentially to make sure that you have certain governance checks, that people are doing things well. So it's not just creating SQL, but you create maintainable SQL that over time, it's obviously simpler to maintain. So here's some of the guidance that we talk about. Now, we came up with these names. It doesn't have to be these names, but thinking about your data from a staging, that's what this layer is, your core models, your facts and dimensions, and then this concept of coves. So a cove is actually a little more than just marks. What we wanted to do is think about this from the perspective of a a group of people working together. So one of the problems that I saw in industry in general is, if you think about before we had these large data lakes and data warehouses, if you go to the accounts payable analytics team, they would have an Excel file, some extract that somebody did with purchase orders, invoices, vendors. And then they did big lookups in Excel and did whatever they wanted. And then eventually that didn't scale, right? So then we tell them, well, go use the data warehouse. And now you overwhelm them. They had 3 things and now it's 100 things, right? And it's just like way too much. So I said, why don't we go back to that? Why don't we create a schema that is for account payable analytics that has the 3 things that they need with just the columns that they need. And by the way, if you have people that know SQL, that is the place where they can experiment. They can create additional KPIs because those are not shared facts and dimensions.
Would you consider that a data product from an industry term?
So I would consider, yeah, I mean, all of these things are to some extent a data product. So in a real like large project, you would have here like your geographical data, your DIM calendars, all of these things are different folders, which correlate to a schema. And so the idea was make this easy. So if I'm looking for vendor data, it would be here a vendor folder. And then that vendor folder could be seen as a product, right? It's got a black box that is managed by and owned by certain teams. And what comes out of that is the interface that other people are using. We're really excited about things like DBT 1.5 and 1.6, because you can now take that stuff, and that's the thing that you publish, right? The public interfaces versus the private internal intermediate models and stuff like that. But that is exactly what we're doing. Now over here, what we're saying is, we are having, in this case, I have 2 different teams, one that focuses on COVID and one that focuses on loans. And I'm exposing certain facts and dimensions so that they don't have to recreate DIM calendar as an example. They can both leverage that, or they may both need the customer list, but they may need different attributes from the customer list. So over here, I may have my customer dimension with 300 columns. And then over here, I'm giving these guys 40 and this other group, 100 or whatever. So it's that way of presenting data in a more user-friendly way.
Excellent.
Let me just show you back to, the accelerator. So, right here, I have a source that's in my raw database with loans, and I have this table. Well, the hardest, I guess more tedious, not hard, but a tedious task in DBT is putting that initial configuration, like linking to your tables and building those staging models, et cetera. And so what we felt was like, well, we can make that better. So we have code here. We have, and by the way, you can see here, we have another extension here that simplifies for people who don't know all the DBT commands and stuff. Here's a starting point, so you don't have to know everything. But we created this extension, and this is freely available. It's an open source library called DBT Coves. And one of the functions there is generating sources. So what this does is it goes and checks what are all the schemas that I have within my database, in my raw database in this case, and I can pass parameters and stuff. But now I say, okay, I want another table in this schema, and here are the 2 tables that are in that schema. And so this top one already exists. I want the second one. This was data that was loaded with Airbyte. So we'll see now it detects that I have a variant column. There's my Airbyte data column, and it's asking, well, do you want me to flatten it for you? Right? So I say, yes, I want you to flatten it for me. And now this one is saying, well, do you want me to update this source file? So this is essentially like the source YAML. And so if I update this, now it added this second table right there. Okay. And you see that it created these 2 files. So here's my SQL, and you can see there is the flattening already happening for me. So I didn't have to type all of that kind of stuff. And it created my YAML file with all of my columns. Okay. Now, another piece that's kind of painful is putting descriptions to all of this stuff. So we can use ChatGPT and have ChatGPT write the documentation. So you see, so it's going to go out there, and what I have found, and I've tried this with many models, it's pretty good. And even if it isn't 100% right, so you see it's almost done there. And yeah, admitted that was the last one. So now I click on that. So there it is. So there's all my description, right? So now I can come in here and then I can say, I don't know, 5 digits, right? Maybe I didn't like that description or this description, but I didn't have to write all this stuff, right? I'm looking for accelerators. How do I quickly get past all of this? We can also, in a large organization, the other thing that you may have is you have people who are the developers writing this code. They may not necessarily themselves know what a good business description is to some of this stuff. Well, we can actually output this stuff instead of this way. We can output it to a CSV file, and then we can say, take that CSV file, send it to someone else, and pre-populate it with descriptions using ChatGPT as well. I have a video on YouTube showing this stuff. And then you send somebody like a preliminary table description with all the columns, they can edit, then you can use that as an input to generate this YAML file. So again, it's thinking about that life cycle.
Do you have the same templates too for something that is always of a pain to me, the test cases, maybe using the DBT tests or like GreatExpectations? I'm guessing you're more using the DBT test. Do you have
we can use either one. So yeah, we actually, I have an article on that, like using DBT utils test, DBT core has tests, and DBT expectations has tests. So you can use any of those. What we have, by the way, if you don't like the templates, the way this is generated, these are all, you can override them. So here's the templates that are used to create this stuff. So you can see there is, essentially some Jinja template that will create this. So if you wanted to have tests, you would, for example, put tests in here and then, maybe have a not null or something, right? So every time it generates it, it would have that in there. So you could do as much or as little as you want with this stuff. There's also the configurations here. So where are these things going to get generated? So you can see it's going to put it in this specific path, but you can change that to wherever you want. There's how we generate those metadata. So the CSV that I was talking about. There's how we can extract and load from Airbyte and Fivetran. So again, it's very flexible. And in this case, DBT Coves is an open source library. And then, so now you've generated this stuff, but your next thing is you want to like maybe look at that model that was created. So one thing that we can do here is, and you can see, sorry, let me fix this here. So I can come and I can say, I want to limit 3 and I can explore this data. So now this is another extension that we have that in this case, it's refreshing the project. That's what we're seeing here. So there we go. So now it queried Snowflake and I can see here's that JSON data. So you can actually look at the data if you wanted to validate something. So you can see that we're only querying this CTE because I highlighted it. If I don't select anything, then it's going to show me what the flattened version of this looks like. So there it is. So again, it's keeping you in the flow, keeping you where you are. Yeah.
Very nice, very nice. So it does sound like there is a lot you've done, a lot of the proliferation and the fragmentation we've seen in the modern data stack. You've taken that, you've distilled it, you're putting it best practices, you're bringing a lot of templates, you're simplifying how folks could access that. Maybe let's bring this back from a higher level and talk about, because I think you have the observe there as well. There is the orchestrate, there is the analyze. Talk about the North Star for Datacoves as an organization, and where do you see that holy grail for analytics teams keep going? You can pontificate, you can talk about what you're actually seeing on the ground and just share that vision with the audience.
Yeah. So our vision has always been to simplify. And let me just give you a little bit of a background. A while ago, I worked in this web framework called Ruby on Rails. And the thing that I learned in that experience was that every Ruby on Rails project looks like every other Ruby on Rails project. And in the beginning, when I started with Ruby on Rails, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just following because they were telling me, do this way, put this information here, put this other information there. And it took me a while to understand why I was doing those things. And then I had an appreciation for that. And I feel like in analytics, we don't have that. In analytics, we're not opinionated enough. And so what ends up happening is you get all sorts of different projects, different ways of doing things. Now, DBT is sort of helping us get there, but there's still more to go. And so when you're deciding, should I do dimensional modeling or not, people don't even know which way to go. Right? And so when we're talking about tooling, when we're talking about processes, there's a reason for that I know, and someone you may not understand it yet. And so what we're saying is, we're going to tell you, use these tools. This will help you get from A to Z, and do it this way because this is sort of like a scalable way that'll be more resilient to change in the long term. So it's to me, it's about that. How do we accelerate productivity? How do we make sure that people work better together with that common language? So I talked about naming conventions. It's a thing that's so important. So like, again, like we came up with these names, but the concept behind this, and I have pages on describing like how you name these folders and these schemas, and why don't you make three? I've seen stuff where you have three schemas. One's called landing and staging and work or whatever. And then you have 500 models or 500 relations in there, right? Views and table. Like I can't make sense of that. It's just too overwhelming. But if we make it into smaller folders and we have some rhyme or reason, then it makes more sense. And now you can have different teams come in and out, and it's simpler for them to get up to speed. Because that to me, that's the most important thing. Like I can have a new team member join and become productive as quickly as possible and deliver quality work. And what I've seen, talking about like real life, what we're seeing with customers is we have seen a really large organizations where you have a lot of silos and division of work. So you may have analytics team in a country, analytics team in a region. They work with client facing IT organizations who then work with the data engineering team, and they work with an external provider. And you see a lot of friction between these different teams, because they don't have visibility. There's no transparency of what's going on. So then you have like, I don't trust, is this number calculated right? Why is this taking so long? Well, now we're changing that because with DBT, if you understand SQL, you can make your way all the way back. You don't have to trust anybody. You can actually see it. With the lineage, you have access to the SQL, the project is the same, right? So it changes how people work. And we have seen this because now like people who used to be feuding with each other now understand. They're like, oh, this is what you need. And the conversation changes into how do you empower me more versus why aren't you doing what I need?
Wow, very powerful. So bringing software engineering practices from your Ruby on Rails background into data, it seems like data is always playing catch up to the software world, unfortunately, from DevOps has been around for a while. And then now we have DataOps. We keep catching up in the data space. Fascinating. Last question to bring this home is pricing. Let's talk about, I'm guessing there is some open source here, but there is also some value added with the SaaS application. For the audience that might be looking at getting access to this, touch a little bit on pricing. Is it seat-based, consumption-based, user-based? What's the go-to-market for the product?
Yes. So we have the SaaS version. If you go to datacoves.com/pricing, it's all outlined there. But essentially we have a starter plan. You're a small team. You don't need all the bells and whistles. You don't need all these different environments and different projects and all of that. For $299, you get everything. You get everything. You get all the compute. And what we do is we limit how many hours of compute. So then we could have an additional charge. If I have a customer that needs to run jobs that last, 10 hours a day versus somebody else who's doing something that's 10 minutes a day, we have to differentiate that. But there's that starting point. Then we have a growth plan, we call it, where it's for more complex organizations where you may want to have multiple instances of Airflow running. You don't want superset. You don't want the Airbyte. And so it's more a la carte. You have different pricing for each of these different components. And then when we get to the enterprise, if they have an on-prem type of installation, then we do it either by the seat or by the cluster. Because in that case, it's running in their infrastructure. And so, we have that flexibility as well. And just to give you an example, people who are really trying to empower many people, so they're going to have a lot of users, we become really attractive from a price perspective because at scale, we're very inexpensive. For example, we have one client where a cluster, they have over 140 people. And so you think about if you were paying per seat for 140, it's not good. And the other, kind of philosophy in my mind is I don't want a license to be the reason why someone has to go use a different tool. But, go back and use Excel because you can't, we can't give you access to data. I want to remove that barrier.
Absolutely. And then obviously for the ones that require like a Snowflake license,
that's
then that's separate. It's just tied to whatever contractual agreement they have with Snowflake as part of that. Really exciting.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, the reason we do that is because in the larger enterprises, they would rather have that relationship with those companies. So we could do it either way. We have talked about offering Snowflake as as a service, essentially create an account and we pass them to Snowflake, but we haven't done that yet.
Okay, great, fascinating demo, fascinating work your team is doing. How can folks find you, get in contact with you, or if they want to go and have a discussion with your team, where can they find you online? Are there any links, resources you want to call out?
Yeah. The simplest thing is to go to Datacoves.com, and right there we have a request a demo and we can get into more detail. There's still a lot of stuff that we didn't cover, obviously, because of time, but any kind of needs, any suggestions, we also help people. Our goal is really to sell the product, but we do some professional services in the early stages. So when they're evaluating these different tools, when they want to show an end-to-end process that then get buy-in, what is the new world going to look like more than slide, we help with that early part as well. So any of those kinds of things, we're available to help and answer any questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Noel. Glad to have you on the show. We're going to leave links to all of that in the description below. For those who are interested in learning more, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Reach out to the team. It's a very fascinating product. Thanks again, Noel, for coming on board.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.